I have a story for you. Today we're going to learn about Saul and how he worked hard to tell the people how God changed his life. He started the very first churches, and he wrote letters to these churches that we still read today in the New Testament. These are the letters he wrote: Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, Philemon, and maybe Hebrews. So let's get started with our story. In the beginning, there was a baby. His parents named him Saul, after the first king of Israel, King Saul. He lived in Tarsus with his family, and his family made tents. Can you see the tents in the background here? His family made tents for the Roman army, and because of that, Saul was permitted to become a Roman citizen. Now, the thing that Saul loved most was to learn about the Jewish law. He loved to study the Old Testament books that had all of the rules and laws that his people should follow. He was very smart and he learned fast. He wanted to be a lawyer and make sure that everybody kept these laws. So when he was old enough, he moved to Jerusalem. And here we see him in the temple being taught. He was taught more and more about the Old Testament scriptures and the law. Saul joined the group called the Pharisees, and he had very little patience for anyone who did not follow all of their customs and laws. One day he heard about the group called the Followers of the Way. These were the disciples of Jesus and all of his friends. But this really made Saul angry because Saul knew the Romans had crucified Jesus. So Saul thought that God wanted him to arrest and persecute and even kill these followers of the way. The high priest in the temple saw that Saul was doing such a good job that he sent a letter to Saul asking him to go to Damascus to arrest more followers of the way and bring them back to Jerusalem, where they would be put on trial. And so Saul went to Damascus, and on his way, riding his horse, he saw a bright light. It was so bright that it blinded him. And he heard a voice that said, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And Saul said, "Who are you, Lord?" And the voice said, "I am Jesus of Nazareth, the one you are persecuting. Get up and go into the city, to the street called Straight, and wait. Someone will come and help you." Saul stood up, but he couldn't see. His men led him into the city of Damascus and to the street called Straight and to a house where he waited. For 3 days he couldn't eat, and of course he couldn't see because he was blinded. Then on the 3rd day, Saul heard another voice that said, "Brother Saul, I am Ananias. Jesus sent me to you. He told me to lay hands on you and pray for you that you would be filled with the Holy Spirit. I was afraid to come at first because I know you're looking for people like me to arrest. But then Jesus said that I could trust you. Jesus told me he changed your life and that you had a very important job to do." So Ananias laid his hands on Saul and prayed for him. And immediately Saul was filled with the Holy Spirit, and the scales fell from his eyes, and he could see. Saul felt the Holy Spirit in him, bringing him power and joy and peace. He got up and he had a meal with Ananias, and they talked. And a few days later, he left the house and he went immediately to the temple, where he told everyone, "Jesus changed me. He is the Messiah. He is alive." But the people in the temple didn't want to hear anything about Jesus. They wanted Saul to be arrested. So they had the guards stand at the gates of the city to be sure that Saul didn't escape. He was being held prisoner there. At nighttime, when everything was dark, the followers of the way, who were the new friends of Saul, took him to the high walls of the city. They had a large basket and long ropes. Paul got in the basket, and they lowered him down on the outside of the city gates so that he could escape. But where would he go? So he went into the desert of Arabia. And while he was in the desert, he looked at all of the empty space, and he listened to all of the silence. And he prayed. He prayed to God, and he came so close to God. And God came so close to him that Saul knew what he was to do. God told him that he would go to all of the nations and that he would tell people his story, how Jesus was alive and how Jesus had changed his life. He would start churches, and then he would write letters to these churches to encourage them and to teach them more about God's ways of love. Saul was in the desert for a long time, but now it was time for him to begin his work. He was to teach the Gentiles, who were the non-Jewish people. He sailed across the sea. He walked across the land. He spent so much time in the Roman territories that he changed his name to Paul, which was his Roman name. Everywhere Paul went, people became believers in Jesus. And now God told Paul to go back to Jerusalem, where he met Peter and James and the other believers who now called themselves Christians. They didn't know if they could trust Paul at first, because they remembered that when he was Saul, he was arresting and persecuting Christians. But they soon saw that God had changed this man from a man of hatred to a man of love. And they trusted him, and they called him their brother. Many of the new churches that he started had questions and problems. And so Paul wrote letters. Here we see him writing. He wrote letters to the churches. He wrote letters to the Colossians, to the Galatians, the Ephesians, the Corinthians, the Philippians, and even to the Romans. He told them how to solve their problems. He told them about God and about Jesus and about his ways of love. And he wrote lots and lots of things to encourage him. And we still read these letters today. Paul took many trips around the Mediterranean, around the whole world that they knew at that time. He visited these cities and he taught them about God and about Jesus. Finally, Paul went to Jerusalem one last time. The first place he went was to the temple because he had a vow to keep. Even though he had become a Christian, he still practiced being a Jew. But when he went into the temple, the people didn't want him there, and they pushed him out, and they came against him to beat him. But the guards stepped in, and they protected Paul with their long swords and their shields, because he was a Roman citizen. And so they protected Paul and put him under house arrest, where he had to stay in his home. He continued to write letters to the churches, and he continued to tell people about Jesus and how he had changed his life. Finally, it was time for Paul to go to Rome, where he would stand trial. He sailed across the Mediterranean Sea, and a big storm came, and the whole ship was sinking, but Paul and all of the crew were saved. They went on to Rome, where Paul stayed on house arrest for 2 years. He continued to write and speak to people about God and about Jesus. We don't know exactly when Paul died, but we didn't hear anything more from him after he was in Rome for 2 years. He was probably killed by the Roman soldiers. Now, I wonder, what was your favorite part of this story? I wonder, was Paul an important person in church history? I wonder, do you think Paul was as important as Jesus was? And I wonder, is Jesus still changing people's hearts and minds today, like he did Saul?